Ooh, that's hot. All right, let's continue with The Life of Samuel Johnson by James Boswell. We're making some pretty good progress. Page 36 now. That's one thing when you decide you're going to start from the paragraph before. This speaks to the writing of the 18th century and the 19th century. You're going to start at the paragraph before, but that's an entire page before. It's one whole paragraph. So actually, it looks like page 36 begins a paragraph, so we can start right there. Yet he appears, from his early notes or memorandums in my possession, to have at various times attempted, or at least planned, a methodical course of study, according to computation, of which he was all his life fond, as it fixed his attention steadily upon something without, and prevented his mind from preying upon itself. Thus I find in his handwriting the number of lines in each of two of Euripides' tragedies, of the Georgics of Virgil, of the first 6 books of the Aeneid, of Horace's Art of Poetry, of 3 of the books of Ovid's Metamorphoses, of some parts of Theocritus, and of the 10th satire of Juvenal, and a table showing, at the rate of various numbers a day, I suppose verses to be read, what would be in each case the total amount in a week, month, and year. No man had a more ardent love of literature, or a higher respect for it than Johnson. His apartment in Pembroke College was that upon the 2nd floor over the gateway. The enthusiast of learning will ever contemplate it with veneration. One day, while he was sitting in it quite alone, Dr. Panting, then master of the college, whom he called a fine Jacobite fellow, overheard him uttering this soliloquy in his strong, emphatic voice. Well, I have in mind to see what is done in other places of learning. I'll go and visit the universities abroad. I'll go to France and Italy. I'll go to Padua. And I'll mind my business. For an Athenian blockhead is the worst of all blockheads. Subtext 1. I had this anecdote from Dr. Adams, and Dr. Johnson confirm it. Dr. Adams told me that Johnson, while he was at Pembroke College, was caressed and loved by all about him, was a gay and frolicsome fellow, and passed there the happiest part of his life. But this is a striking proof of the fallacy of appearances, and how little any of us know of the real internal state, even of those whom we see most frequently. For the truth is that he was then depressed by poverty, and irritated by disease. When I mentioned to him this account as given me by Dr. Adams, he said, "Ah, sir, I was mad and violent. It was bitterness which they mistook for frolic. I was miserably poor, and I thought to fight my way by my literature and my wit. So I disregarded all power and all authority." Oh, so that's what he was up to at the time, huh? Because I know that he didn't stay very long, that he was not necessarily the best student. The Bishop of Dromore observes in a letter to me, "The pleasure he took in vexing the tutors and fellows has been often mentioned. But I have heard him say, what ought to be recorded to the honor of the present venerable master of that college, Rudy, it's just rain. You don't have to get upset. Come here." The Reverend William Adams, D.D., who was then very young and one of the junior fellows, that this mild but judicious expostulations of this worthy man, whose virtue awed him and whose learning he revered, made him really ashamed of himself, though I fear, said he, I was too proud to own it. I have heard from some of his contemporaries that he was generally seen lounging at the college gate, with a circle of young students around him, whom he was entertaining with wit, and keeping from their studies, if not spiriting them up to rebellion against the college discipline, which in his maturer years he so much extolled. At very early, he very early began to attempt keeping notes or memorandums by way of a diary of his life. I find in a parcel of loose leaves the following spirited resolution to contend against his natural indolence. October 1729. Oh, and it's in Latin, so I can't read it. Disde valaxedi cinerenzem istius cantibus surdam post hoc arium observanus. I don't even know. I don't know. Oh, maybe this is it, the translation. I bid farewell to sloth, being resolved henceforth not to listen to her siren strains. Oh, that's what he said. I have also in my possession a few leaves of another libellus, or little book, entitled Annales, in which some of the early particulars of his history are registered in Latin. I do not find that he formed any close intimacies with his fellow collegians, but Dr. Adams told me that he contracted a love and regard for Pembroke College, which he retained to the last. A short time before his death, he sent to that college a present of all his works to be deposited in their library, and he had thoughts of leaving to it his house at Lichfield. But his friends who were about him very properly dissuaded him from it, and he bequeathed it to some poor relations. He took a pleasure in boasting of the many eminent men who had been educated at Pembroke. In this list are found the names of Mr. Hawkins, the poetry professor, Mr. Shenstone, Sir William Blackstone, and others, not forgetting the celebrated popular preacher, Mr. George Whitefield, of whom, though Dr. Johnson did not think very highly, it must be acknowledged that his eloquence was powerful, his views pious and charitable, his assiduity almost incredible. And that since his death, the integrity of his character has been fully vindicated. Being himself a poet, Johnson was peculiarly happy in mentioning how many of the sons of Pembroke were poets, adding, with a smile of sportive triumph, "Sir, we are a nest of singing birds." He was not, however, blind to what he thought the defects of his college. Pardon me. And I have, from the information of Dr. Tyler, a very strong insistence of that rigid honesty which he ever inflexibly preserved. Tyler had obtained his father's consent to be entered of Pembroke, that he might be with his schoolfellow Johnson, with whom, though some years older than himself, he was very intimate. This would have been a great comfort to Johnson, but he fairly told Tyler that he could not, in conscience, suffer him to enter where he knew he could not have an able tutor. He then made inquiry all around the university, and having found that Mr. Bateman of Christ Church was the tutor of highest reputation, Tyler was entered of that college. Mr. Bateman's lectures were so excellent that Johnson used to come and get them at second hand from Tyler, till his poverty being so extreme that his shoes were worn out and his feet appeared through them, he saw that this humiliating circumstance was perceived too proud to accept of money. It was perceived by the Christ Church men, and he came no more. So he was ashamed of his poverty. He was too proud to accept of money, and somebody having set a new pair of shoes at his door, he threw them away with indignation. How must we feel when we read such an anecdote of Samuel Johnson? Well, here's a word. Eleemosynary. His spirited refusal of an eleemosynary supply of shoes arose, no doubt, from a proper pride. But considering his ascetic disposition at times, as acknowledged by himself in his meditations, and the exaggeration with which some have treated the peculiarities of his character, I should not wonder to hear it ascribed to a principle of superstitious mortifications. mortification, as we are told by Trusselius in his Life of St. Ignatius Loyola, that this intrepid founder of the order of Jesuits, when he arrived at Goa, after having made a severe pilgrimage through the eastern deserts, persisted in wearing his miserable shattered shoes, and when new ones were offered him, rejected them as an unsuitable indulgence. The res angusta domi prevented him from having the advantage of a complete academical education. The friend to whom he had trusted for support had deceived him. His debts in college, though not great, were increasing, and his scanty remittances from Lichfield, which had all long been made with great difficulty, could be supplied no longer, his father having fallen into a state of insolvency. Compelled, therefore, by irresistible necessity, he left the college in autumn 1731 without a degree, having been a member of it for a little more than 3 years. Dr. Adams, the worthy and respectable master of Pembroke College, has generally had the reputation of being Johnson's tutor. The fact, however, is that in 1731, Mr. Jordan quitted the college, and his pupils were transferred to Dr. Adams, so that had Johnson returned, Dr. Adams would have been his tutor. It is to be wished that this connection had taken place. His equal temper, mild disposition, and politeness of manners might have insensibly softened the harshness of Johnson, and infused into him those more delicate charities, those petitis moralis, in which, it must be confessed, our great moralist was more deficient than his best friends could fully justify. Dr. Adams paid Johnson this high compliment. He said to me at Oxford in 1776, "I was his nominal tutor, but he was above my mark." When I repeated it to Johnson, his eyes flashed with grateful satisfaction, and he exclaimed, "That was liberal and noble." And now, I had almost said poor, Samuel Johnson returned to his native city, destitute, and not knowing how he should gain even a decent livelihood. His father's misfortunes in trade rendered him unable to support his son, and for some time there appeared no means by which he could maintain himself. In the December of this year, his father died. The state of poverty in which he died appears from a note in one of Johnson's little diaries of the following year, which strongly displays his spirit and virtuous dignity of mind. 1732, July 15th, and this is all in Latin. I won't even try to read it. It's like a whole paragraph. Hi, Abby. I laid by 11 guineas on this day, when I received 20 pounds, being all that I have reason to hope for out of my father's effects, previous to the death of my mother, an event which, I pray God, may be very remote. I now therefore see that I must make my own fortune. Meanwhile, let me take care of that power of my mind, that the power of my mind be not debilitated by poverty, and that indigence do not force me into any criminal act. It's a word I don't know. Johnson was so far fortunate that the respectable character of his parents and his own merit had, from his earliest years, secured him a kind reception in the best families at Lichfield. Among these I can mention Mr. Howard, Dr. Swinfen, Mr. Simpson, Mr. Levet, Captain Garrick, father of the great ornament of the British stage, but above all, Mr. Gilbert Walmsley, registrar of the ecclesiastical court of Lichfield, whose character, long after his decease, Dr. Johnson has, in his Life of Edmund Smith, thus drawn in the glowing colors of gratitude. A quote: "Of Gilbert Walmsley, thus presented to my mind, let me indulge myself in his remembrance. I knew him very early. He was one of the first friends that literature procured me, and I hope that at least my gratitude made me worthy of his notice. He was of an advanced age, and I was only not a boy. Yet he never received my notions with contempt. He was a Whig, with all the virulence and malevolence of this party, yet difference of opinion did not keep us apart. I honored him, and he endured me. He had mingled with the gay world without exemption from its vices or its follies, but had never neglected the cultivation of his mind. His belief of revelation was unshaken. His learning preserved his principles. He grew first regular and then pious. That's interesting. I wonder how he gained what principles he gained that his learning preserved. Probably religious. His studies had been so various that I am not able to name a man of equal knowledge. His acquaintance with books was great, and what he did not immediately know, he could, at least, tell where to find. Such was his amplitude of learning, and such his copiousness of communication, that it may be doubted whether a day now passes in which I have not some advantage from his friendship. At this man's table I enjoyed many cheerful and instructive hours, with companions such as are not often found, with one who has lengthened and one who has gladdened life, with Dr. James, whose skill in physic will be long remembered, and with Dr. Garrick, whom I hoped to have gratified with his character of our common friend. But what are the hopes of a man? I am disappointed by that stroke of death which has eclipsed the gaiety of nations and impoverished the public stock of harmless pleasures. In these families he passed much time in his early years. In most of them he was in the company of ladies, particularly at Lady Walmsley's, whose wife and sisters-in-law of the name of Aston, and daughters of a baronet, were remarkable for good breeding, so that the notion which has been industriously circulated and believed, that he never was in good company till late in life, and consequently had been confirmed in coarse and ferocious manners by long habits, is wholly without foundation. Some of the ladies have assured me they recollect him well when a young man, as distinguished for his complaisance. And that his politeness was not merely occasional and temporary or confined to the circles of Lichfield is ascertained by the testimony of a lady, who, in a paper with which I have been favored by a daughter of his intimate friend and physician, Dr. Lawrence, thus describes Dr. Johnson some years afterwards. As the particulars of the former part of Dr. Johnson's life do not seem to be very accurately known, a lady hopes that the following information may not be unacceptable. She remembers Dr. Johnson on a visit to Dr. Taylor at Ashburn, sometime between the end of the year 37 and the middle of the year 40. She rather thinks it to have been after he and his wife were removed to London. During his stay at Ashburn, he made frequent visits to Mr. Meynell at Bradley, where his company was much desired by the ladies of the family, who were, perhaps, in point of elegance and accomplishments, inferior to few of those with whom he was afterwards acquainted. Mr. Meynell's eldest daughter was afterwards married to Mr. Fitzberts, a father to Alian Fitzbert, lately minister to the court of Russia. Of her, Dr. Johnson said in Dr. Lawrence's study that she had the best understanding he ever met with in any human being. At Mr. Maynard's, he also commenced that friendship with Mrs. Hill Boothby, sister to the present Sir Brooke Boothby, which continued till her death. The young woman whom he used to call Molly Aston was sister to Sir Thomas Aston and daughter to a baronet. She was also sister to the wife of his friend, Mr. Gilbert Walmsley. Besides his intimacy with the above-mentioned persons, who were surely people of rank and education, while he was at Lichfield, he used to frequently at the house of Dr. Swinson, a gentleman of very ancient family at Stratford, from which, after the death of his elder brother, he inherited a good estate. He was, besides, a physician of very excellent practice, but for want of due attention to the management of his domestic concerns, left a very large family in indigence. Must mean poor. One of his daughters, Mrs. Desmoulins, afterwards found an asylum in the house of her old friend, whose doors were always open to the unfortunate, and who well observed the precept of the gospel, for he was kind to the unthankful and to the evil. In the forlorn state of his circumstances, he appeared of an offer to be employed as usher in the school of Market Bosworth in Leicestershire, to which it appears from one of his little fragments of a diary that he went on foot on the 16th of July. But it is not true, as has been erroneously related, that he was assistant to the famous Anthony Blackwall, whose merit has been honored by the testimony of Bishop Hurd, who was his scholar, for Mr. Blackwell died on the 8th of April, 1730, more than a year before Johnson left the university. This employment was very irksome to him in every respect, and he complained grievously of it in his letters to his friend, Mr. Hector, who was now settled as a surgeon at Birmingham. The letters are lost, but Mr. Hector recollects the writing, that the poet had described the dull sameness of his excellence of his existence in these words, and here's some Latin: vitam continet una dies. One day contains the whole of my life. And that it was unvaried as the note of the cuckoo, and that he did not know whether it was more disagreeable for him to teach or the boys to learn the grammar rules. His general aversion to this painful drudgery was greatly enhanced by a disagreement between him and Sir Wolston Dixie, the patron of the school, in whose house, I have been told, he officiated as a kind of domestic chaplain, so far at least as to say grace at table, but was treated with what he represented as intolerable harshness, and, after suffering for a few months such complicated misery, he relinquished a situation which all his life afterwards he recollected with the strongest aversion, and even a degree of horror. But it is probable that at this point, whatever uneasiness he may have endured, he laid the foundation of much future eminence by application to his studies. Being now again totally unoccupied, he was invited by Mr. Hector to pass some time with him at Birmingham as his guest at the house of Mr. Warren, with whom Mr. Hector lodged and boarded. Mr. Warren was the first established bookseller in Birmingham, and was very attractive to Johnson, who he soon found could be of much service to him in the trade by his knowledge of literature, and he even obtained the assistance of his pen in furnishing some numbers of a periodical essay printed in the newspaper, of which Warren was proprietor. After very diligent inquiry, I have not been able to recover those early specimens of that particular mode of writing by which Johnson afterwards so greatly distinguished himself. He continued to live as Mr. Hector's guest for about 6 months, and then hired lodgings in another part of the town, finding himself as well situated at Birmingham as he supposed he could be anywhere, while he had no settled plan of life, and very scanty means of sustenance. He made some valuable acquaintances there, among whom were Mr. Porter, a mercer, whose widow he afterwards married, and Mr. Taylor, who by his ingenuity in mechanical inventions and his success in trade acquired an immense fortune. But the comfort of being near Mr. Hector, his old schoolfellow and intimate friend, was Johnson's chief inducement to continue here. In what manner he employed his pen at this period, or whether he derived from it any pecuniary advantage, I have not been able to ascertain. He probably got a little money from Mr. Warren, and we are certain that he executed here one piece of literary labor, of which Mr. Hector has favored me with a minute account. Having mentioned that he had read at Pembroke College A Voyage to Abyssinia by Lobo, a Portuguese Jesuit, and that he thought an abridgment and translation of it from the French into English might be a useful and profitable publication. Mr. Warren and Mr. Hector joined in urging him to undertake it. He accordingly agreed, and the book not being to be found in Birmingham, he borrowed it of Pembroke College. A part of the work being very soon done, one Osborne, who was Mr. Warren's printer, was set to work with what was ready, and Johnson engaged to supply the press with copy as soon as it should be wanted. But his constitutional indolence soon prevailed, and the work was at a stand. Mr. Hector, who knew that a motive of humanity would be the most prevailing argument with his friend, went to Johnson and represented to him that the printer could have no other employment till this undertaking was finished, and that the poor man and his family were suffering. Johnson, upon this exerted the powers of his mind, though his body was relaxed. He lay in bed with the book, which was a quarto, before him, and dictated while Hector wrote. Mr. Hector carried the sheets to the press, and corrected almost all the proof sheets, very few of which were ever even seen by Johnson. In this manner, and with the aid of Mr. Hector's active friendship, the book was completed, and was published in 1735, with London upon the title page, though it was in reality printed at Birmingham. A device too common with provincial publishers. For this work he had from Mr. Warren only the sum of 5 guineas. This being the first prose work of Johnson, it is a curious object of inquiry how much may be traced in it of that style which marks the subsequent writings with such peculiar excellence, with so happy a union of force, vivacity, and perspicuity. I have perused the book with this view, and have found that here, as I believe in every other translation, there is in the work itself no vestige of the translator's own style, for the language of translation, being adapted to the thoughts of another person, insensibly follows their cast, and as it were runs into the mold that is already prepared. Wow. Thus, for instance, taking the first sentence that occurs at the opening of a book, page 4, I lived here above a year and completed my studies in divinity, in which time some letters were received from the fathers of Ethiopia, with an account that Sultan Segned, Emperor of Abyssinia, was converted to the Church of Rome, that many of his subjects had followed his example, and that there was a great want of missionaries to improve these prosperous beginnings. Everybody was desirous of seconding the zeal of our fathers, and of sending them the assistance they requested, to which we were the more encouraged, because the emperor's letter informed our provincial that we might easily enter his dominions by the way of Dankala. But unhappily, the secretary wrote Gallia for Dankala, which cost 2 of our fathers their lives. Every one acquainted with Johnson's manner will be sensible that there is nothing of it here, but that this sentence might have been composed by any other man. But in the preface, the Johnsonian style begins to appear, and though use had not yet taught his wing a permanent and equable flight, there are parts of it which exhibit his best manner in full vigor. I had once the pleasure of examining it with Mr. Edwin Burke, who confirmed me in this opinion by his superior critical sagacity, and was, I remember, much delighted with the following specimen. The Portuguese traveler, contrary to the general vein of his countrymen, has amused his reader with no romantic absurdity or incredible fictions. Whatever he relates, whether true or not, it is at least probable. And he who tells nothing exceeding the bounds of probability has a right to demand that they should believe him who cannot contradict him. He appears by his modest and unaffected narration to have described things as he saw them, to have copied nature from the life, and to have consulted his senses, not his imagination. He meets with no ballistics that destroy with their eyes. Basilisks, which destroy with their eyes. His crocodiles devour their prey without tears, and his cataracts fall from the rocks without deafening the neighboring inhabitants. All right, I think that's good enough for tonight. Seems like just as I start to roll into it, it's time to go down for dinner. Let's see, any comments? Tippy, Merry Christmas to you. Shizuoka Blues, hi Rob, like yourself. He says, Mike Hunt says, hi Kurt, hope you are well and have a good Christmas and a safe New Year. Thank you, I'm doing well. I wish the same to you. V, thank you for the reading, you're welcome. Shizuoka Blues, frolicsome. Nice reading. I could tutor you in Latin if you like. Really? You know Latin? Wow. In Vito Veritas, you said. I can't even begin to pronounce it. Not me, at least not yet. Still mourning in Japan. Hi, friends. Hi. And Sayanian says, hi, Kurt. Hope your Christmas goes well. I enjoyed your videos with Erica. She is relaxing like you. Hope you can do something like that in the future. Oh, thank you. And Erica is great. And VORONG. Not sure what that means. Okay, well, have a great rest of the day, everybody. And we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.